Introduction to the Management of Information Security. The learning outcomes for Chapter 1 are shown below. First, a note for all slides, unless otherwise noted, images are CCO licensed, which requires no attribution, or they are taken directly from the textbook, or they are my own original works. The learning outcomes for Chapter 1 are listed here, and we will have separate sections to discuss each. First, we'll look at the importance of the manager's role in securing information assets of the organization. We'll then look a little more closely at the key characteristics of information security. Next, we will list and describe categories of threats to information security. Finally, we'll discuss governance and management of information assets. So let's start with Section 1, which is really an introduction to information security. In this section, if you recall the 4 learning outcomes, we will be looking at the first one, the manager's role in securing information assets. Introducing this topic, IT does provide the means of storing and transferring information between and among business units, among people, but the most valuable asset in the organization is information except for people, which is the most valuable asset. Information security began as computer security. It's also been called information security. The government often calls it information security and assurance. The current latest buzzword is cyber security. So we may use those terms interchangeably throughout the semester. If we look at who is interested in securing information assets of the organization, of course, you've got your general business. Those people articulate and communicate the policy, the strategy. They also allocate the money, the people, and other resources. Then you've got information technology. They look at supporting and achieving organizational goals by delivering technology. Finally, information security protects the information assets of the organization. All of these communities are overlapping. They must talk to each other. If they don't, none can be successful. Let's look at a couple of definitions of security, and these are just from Merriam-Webster. The quality or state of being secure, free from danger, safety, freedom from fear or anxiety. You may have job security or you may not, and you're afraid you may be laid off. It's also something that's given, that's deposited, or that's pledged to make sure an obligation is fulfilled. You'll see it in contracts where they tell you how they secure the information assets. It's surety, although information security works on knowing that no network is ever 100% secure. It could be a document like a bond or a stock certificate saying that you do have ownership in something, or it could be something that secures or protects, like an insurance policy. It can be measures taken to guard against people getting your information either with good or bad intentions. And it may be the organization or department whose task is security. These might be physical security or security of the information assets. Let's take a closer look at security in any type of organization. Protected from loss, damage, modification of the information assets, other hazards like a flood. You usually achieve security by undertaking a combination of strategies in line with the business strategies. Management should make sure that security strategies are planned, organized, staffed, directed, and controlled, that someone in charge of information security is a high-level, C-level, or almost C-level executive, and that security has the resources that it needs. The specialized areas of security, at least generally, you have physical security, so the night watchman that you may have. You have operations security, maybe a combination of digital and physical security controls. You have communication security, so people can't get in if they're not supposed to be. Same thing with network security. And finally, you have cyber or computer security, which really encompasses all of the above. Information security is protection of the information and whatever gives it value. Your customers, your patients, whatever the data that you have, you want to make sure that you retain its value. You make sure that it's confidential, especially in healthcare. This is important, but it's also important in other areas. You want to make sure that the data you have has integrity, is correct, and you want to make sure it's available. This does include technology that houses and transmits the technology with a variety of mechanisms in place, including policies, training and awareness programs so people don't do things they shouldn't, and of course, appropriate technology. To summarize Section 1, securing an organization's information assets is certainly a very important part of an information security manager's responsibilities. Protecting the organization's information assets makes sure that they're confidential, they have integrity, they are available for customer and PII or personally identifiable information. The protection of these information assets is a combination of policies, training, and technology taken together. Now we move to the second section of Chapter 1, where we look at models and a little bit about information value. If you remember those 4 learning outcomes, here we've moved to the second one, where we look at key characteristics of InfoSec. The CIA Triad looks at information security with a triad, 3 components: integrity, availability, and confidentiality. They consider these critical characteristics of information. If we move to the CNSS model, or the Macomber Cube, they cover the similar 3 dimensions of information security, but they don't include a discussion of the guidelines and policies that make sure controls are in place to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So here you see the Macomber Cube. It doesn't matter which one you look at, as long as you do consider the integrity, availability, and confidentiality, and establish policies and controls to ensure the information assets are reliable, confidential, and available. So let's look at confidentiality first. If you look at the definition, it's an attribute of information that describes how you're going to protect it from inappropriate disclosure or accessibility by unauthorized people or unauthorized systems, bots that may go out. To protect confidentiality, things you can use, you can classify information in certain ways and make sure that only those people who are authorized have access to it. You certainly want to make sure you have secure document and data storage in a variety of methods with backups, off-site facilities, cloud computing, virtualization, whatever you might use. You want to apply good general security policies to all your information assets. You want to make sure that you educate those who are entrusted with the information and the end users who ultimately are the ones that need it and you have to make it available to. Of course, you can use techniques such as encryption or cryptography to make sure the data is encrypted end to end and only those with a key on both ends are able to access it. Next, we move to integrity, and that's just how data is whole, complete, and uncorrupted. What you have is correct and valid. You have a threat to integrity when it is corrupted. Either you have garbled, you have a power surge that messes up your data. You may have damage, so the flood may come and your computer facilities may get wet and damaged. You may have destruction. Someone gets in and gets all of your data and deletes it. Or it may be disrupted in another way that you may not notice immediately. So you have to be on guard and secure your information assets. Next, we look at availability, and this just looks at making sure information assets are accessible, easy to read, correctly formatted for use for whoever needs it without undue interference or obstruction. When you talk about availability, you make sure that authorized users, people, other systems that may be accessing the data have access to it in the format in which they need, so it's usable to them, when they need it, and where they need it, and the location within your servers or wherever it might be. Let's take a closer look at what we mean by privacy, and we'll just look at a couple of dictionary definitions here. The ability of an individual or group to keep their lives and personal affairs out of public view, or to control the flow of information about themselves. Your customers may choose or not choose to have their data released to others, and they may expect a measure of privacy as documented in the privacy policy that we all receive every time we go to a hospital, a clinic, our doctor's office. Privacy is also freedom from unauthorized intrusion. I may allow another doctor to see my test results and my patient history because they're going to be treating me, but it's my choice for it to be private. This is obviously a very important concept in terms of securing the information assets of a healthcare organization. Looking more specifically at information security privacy, the right of individuals or groups to protect themselves and their information from unauthorized access, providing the first of the triad, or one of the three, confidentiality. Very similar to what we consider individual privacy. However, individual privacy is not covered by laws or statutes, while some information security privacy may be covered. Information security privacy also allows the individual to make sure that whatever is collected, used, and stored about them is used only for what it's supposed to be used. What specific rights I've given it, or what specific rights the organization has by virtue of my not opting out, or whatever it might have been. So in this context, privacy does not mean people can't observe, look at me, and that's what we usually associate with privacy. Although I will make a comment, public figures do not have privacy because they have put themselves into the public light willingly. That's why paparazzi follow them. But privacy in this case, in terms of information security privacy, is not freedom from observation. Instead, it means the information on me and on other customers will be used only in ways that I have given, only in ways that I have provided, approved. One problem with information assets, and they're huge, and there are so many companies that is involved, is that they become aggregated, and they can tell so much about me by combining these into big data, sometimes in perfectly legal ways. If you look at the big data chart here, enterprise data owned by an organization, public data, where I live, how old I am, my phone number, sensor data, they may collect by just watching me in a public place or whatever it might be, or the number of steps I take, or my heart rate. Social media, I post a picture and say, hey, I just had to go to the doctor. That's publicly accessible. Transactions I make sometimes are able to be aggregated, particularly by a credit card company. They can choose to share it unless they've agreed to do so, not to do so in other ways. And enterprise data, what the organization. So all of these together make big data on each person. What happens though is that organizations collect a lot of data, then they swap it, but they only do it with their partners, as they told you. And they may sell personal information. If you think of a Google or Microsoft or Facebook, they've got so much data that we've willingly given them. We've also willingly given Kroger information on our buying habits, so they'll give us a discount card. So oftentimes there's a quid pro quo, but in the case even of the Kroger card, I'm giving them much more data than they're giving back to me, but I'm willing to do it. Today, you can combine all of this information and aggregate it and learn a tremendous amount about a person that they may not want you to know. So now you have databases that may be used in ways that I did not agree to allow to being used. I don't even know about it. Think about what's out there that you don't even know about. If we look at identification, this is one of the controls you put in place to try to ensure information security, privacy. In this case, we verify that whoever is trying to access an information asset is the person they claim to be. The technology in place has to be able to recognize me with my login and my password. If you don't identify and authenticate, you're going to set yourself up to share your information assets with those you didn't intend to do. And we usually do it with a username, ID, as you can see in this top right chart. But not only do we have to identify, we also have to authenticate. And here we make sure my password is correct, my fingerprint, my iris scan, whatever it is. And sometimes there's two-factor control. So I log in and then it'll send a code to my cell phone that I'll have to enter in. I have two-factor authentication on some systems. It does become, you don't want it to become so burdensome on the user that it takes them forever to log in or they change their password every time. I have that in some instances, although I use LastPass to help me track all of my passwords. When you authenticate, you make sure the user is who they claim to be. You might have a PIN number, password, passphrase. You may make them change it every 3, 6 months, 1 year, never, whatever it might be. That's why I have so many versions of a password out there, because people make me change at different points in time. Information security managers also have to make sure that they authorize the release of data and that the people who access it are accountable for what they do. If we look at authorization, here we match the entity that we've identified and authenticated to whatever they're supposed to be able to access. A nurse does not have access to the patient files at an unrelated doctor, maybe, or they don't have access to patients that they're not working on unless they have a need to. After authentication, this defines what the user specifically has access to. With accountability, you make sure that every time something happens, you know who did it or who logged in and got it, even if it wasn't the right person. You have an IP address you can check. And here's where you have audit logs that you can refer to when and if an information security incident occurs. To summarize this section, there are numerous models out there that look at information security. They all consider confidentiality, availability, and integrity. Information security privacy is not the same as individual privacy expectations, but information security ensures that what's collected is only used in ways that the customer has approved. We have the problem of companies that aggregate the information on us, sometimes in legal ways, as I mentioned. Here we have another opportunity for data to be used in manners that we did not approve it to be used. Policies should be put in place to guarantee, as much as possible, never 100%, customer privacy. And organizations need to have a plan in place to identify who accesses data, authenticate users to ensure proper protections, authorize those users to whatever access levels they are approved to see, and keep logs, audit logs, of those who did access data and information. Now let's move to the third section of Chapter 1, and this is divided into two parts just so we don't have so much in one of the parts, but this looks at key concepts of information security, some of the threats and attacks that might occur. So if you remember those 4 learning outcomes, again, now we're on the third one. List and describe dominant categories of threats to information security. Looking at Sun Tzu, The Art of War, gives you a way to reflect upon information security, even though he lived long ago, but his famous book, The Art of War. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Know the enemy, know yourself. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. So you got to know both. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. This is certainly relevant to information security, securing the organization's information assets. So if we apply the art of war to information security, know yourself. You need to understand all the information assets you're protecting and the systems, mechanisms, and methods that you're going to use to properly store, transport, process, and protect them. And of course, you need to know your enemy, know the threats you face. The enemy is often within your own camp, and that's something you must be aware of. Threats are always present. A threat is simply a potential risk to an information asset. An attack, however, is an ongoing act against the asset that could result in a loss. So you have a threat. It may or may not be attacked. If it is attacked, there's some sort of threat agents that try to use your vulnerability to steal your physical assets or your information assets by using certain exploits. Attacks exist only when an act may cause a loss, such as unwanted and unauthorized access, theft of data, damage or destruction to data, denial of use, or disclosure of data. Let's take a look at a couple of not so funny intellectual property cartoons before we move into a discussion. This slide shows how we are faced with ethical dilemmas when we try to decide if we want to share files, consider downloading files, movies, songs, and whether our activities are legal or illegal, and ethical or unethical. Sometimes it's simply not easy to tell, and we have to do the best we can to follow all laws while exhibiting professional ethics. Intellectual property, or IP, it describes works of the mind, things that you create. The owner creates, or copyright holder holds rights to something. It's the particular way in which ideas are expressed, and is protected with a variety of means in the U.S. and many other countries, like copyrights, patent, trade secrets, trademarks, and most often click-wrap agreements, where we all click, I agree, even though we don't read the document. In the case of intellectual property, the owner controls and may receive compensation for using the intellectual property. They may also choose not to use it. Owners have legal rights attached to a name, a written document, a recorded sound, an invention. This does imply that intellectual works are similar to physical property, and it is thus a matter of some controversy because you often can't see it, or you have to decide if it's enough of an expression of an idea to be protected. Let's move on to a few examples of intellectual property in the business world. Novel production techniques may qualify for intellectual property protections. Maybe your company develops a new way to insert a part into a car. If it's novel and non-obvious, you may be able to get intellectual property protections. New methods of management may qualify as well, although this area is a little murkier. Meeting ISO standards or achieving certain quality certifications may qualify for protection. These techniques are more intangible and harder to justify when seeking protection. Developing unique product features like adding a fingerprint sign-in option for a cell phone may qualify for IP protection, as may a stylish brand image. The image must be distinct enough for your product to be quickly identified by a customer. If it's generic or if the image is already protected, you may have to make changes or maybe decide not to seek IP protection. When determining the value of IP, courts typically look at how novel or different implementation of ideas leads to something valued by a customer or potential customer, or something that a competitor would like to have. When dealing with intellectual or intangible assets, the value is very difficult to determine when protections are initially requested. Overall, the government's role is to balance the benefits of greater competition to us in terms of better products at lower cost with the benefits of IP protection in terms of companies being willing to invest a whole lot of money up front in research, development, and testing to be willing to embark on risky expenditures. While Hatch-Waxman was passed to try to control the rising cost of prescription meds, the concept of achieving U.S. laws dealing with copyright, patent, and trademarks and other intellectual property, which do all overlap as the picture on the left shows, they originated in the early 1900s. They've been amended often to try to handle changes, but they can't keep up, particularly with the rapid change of technology. Copyright does provide exclusive rights to the copyright owner. As mentioned on the previous slide, these rights are limited to protect competitions in ways that benefit society as a whole, like a new drug to treat a disease that only 100,000 people get. It may not be financially viable if they don't get the protections on that drugs for an initial rollout. IP is protected by copyright and other laws. It does carry an expectation that others who use it will properly attribute or credit the copyright holder, and sometimes you have to ask for permission to use it. If you used IP in unauthorized manners, then information security has to be prepared to deal with that. Have to make sure that your end users, for instance, are not using programs that have not been purchased or that don't meet licensing requirements that you've agreed upon. And you have to make sure that copyrights that your own organization owns are protected and users are registered so you can track who accesses the different data. You can take a look here. There is a debate on what's an idea and what's an expression of an idea. This short YouTube video goes through the concepts pretty good. As an information security manager, you have to be concerned with deviations in quality of service. There are things that are sometimes beyond your control. You have to rely on a power grid, particularly in other countries. That may become problematic. If you have heart monitors set up to monitor your patients and the power goes out, you have to have an adequate backup plan in place, as they learned with Katrina, where they had about 2 days, I think, of backup power for the entire hospital, and they had to evacuate people out. You're relying on imperfect data networks, some of which aren't even controlled by you. You deal with telecommunications and their potential unreliability. They're generally pretty reliable, particularly in the U.S., not true everywhere. You rely on parts and service vendors. For instance, a recent vulnerability has been identified in Intel, AMD, ARD, iOS, and probably many other types of chips and or operating systems. Intel knew about it when they sold their product, but did not have a fix. They are working on it. But you have to rely on somebody to get your chips. Even the cleaning staff may not be their fault. They may damage technology, they may steal something, so you have to make sure you have a good staff. And the garbage haulers, you have to make sure that documents are destroyed in the appropriate manner, particularly confidential or very important with lots of data sources, documents, DVDs, whatever it might be. Some of these deviations may be caused by, like I said, by power supply, power surges. You may have a lightning strike. A lightning strike in the last 3 years has taken out a modem, a router, and a CPU on one, and on the second it took out just our modem. Either way, it's a pain to fix. Irregularities in your internet service provider are also a concern. They have glitches as well. And even some employees being ill and others having to step in for them. This is where you want to make sure you have separation of duties, but you also have a backup in case someone, as I always say, gets hit by a bus. Obviously, we don't want that to happen, but maybe they quit unexpectedly. They get ill and they can't come in. You don't want them in. They'll make your whole workforce sick. You particularly don't want them in if they're in a hospital and they're coughing and sneezing. So all of these things can concern an information security manager, and most of these are beyond their control. That's why you want to have UPS, uninterruptible power service, uninterruptible power sources that will keep you up and running in the event of a power surge. You want to have backup or mirrored systems so that in severe weather you can go to your other system and be able to keep running. You want to have the ability maybe to transfer to another internet service provider or use data from telecom if it's up and running. And for employee illness, make sure they all get flu shots, I guess. People are going to get ill. Forces of nature are obviously very dangerous threats. They may occur with little warning, and there's nothing the information security manager can do about it. So you have to have controls in place to limit the damage. There need to be contingency plans so that your organization can continue to operate. If you're Amazon and you're down for 30 minutes, I don't know the amount of cells you use, but it's a lot. It's significant. If you're in a hospital setting and you're down for 30 minutes, people can die. Most forces of nature can only be mitigated through insurance, although you want to make sure your facilities are designed and placed in areas that can reduce the likelihood of damage, and you want to make sure you have backup systems in place. This is a French word, and I had French in high school, but I don't speak it. Force majeure. Or superior force. This is forces of nature, acts of war, civil disorder. You could be caught up in a protest that becomes a riot. Sometimes you can't predict that. You might have a common clause in your insurance contract that frees both parties from liability when one of these force majeure occurs. So war, strike, riot, crime, other act of God. We're not liable. It's not our fault. It's not the insurance company's fault if something happens after they come in to help. It frees us both from liability. People are going to try to get onto your system. They're going to do it for reasons of espionage, to try to get a head up on you if they're a competitor. They may want to embarrass you by releasing emails, and they certainly are going to come onto your network and look around. Even information security researchers, they do this all day. It's sometimes called trespass to chattel, and it was based on the principle where you had a large herd of cattle, and even if your neighbor's cow came over and ate just a little bit of your grass, it didn't really affect you. It's still your grass, so you can't do that. So even if you use a little bit of bandwidth, it can be trespass. So this is when an unauthorized person is able to gain access to information that should be protected. Some information gathering techniques are legal, like we mentioned before, looking at a web browser on the company to perform market research, looking at their social media postings to try to estimate how much money they have, where they live, where they like to go to restaurants. When people employ techniques that cross that legal and or ethical threshold, it's industrial espionage. These could be password attacks, where you try to guess a person's password, like has been done on iCloud to retrieve naked pictures of several actors and actresses. Some of them said, yeah, it's me. They didn't have a good password. They were able to guess it by their pet, their date of birth, their phone number, whatever they had. That's why you're not supposed to use any of those items in your password. Password attacks can be brute force. You try every possible keyword, password combination. That can take a long time. However, you know what passwords people use. If you look at the keyboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, etc. Football. There's some that are very common that I don't use, and you shouldn't either. A dictionary password attack, and this is where they use common passwords, as I mentioned, and they look at the target user and try to determine what they might like or what they might do. They might use rainbow tables where there's some hash values that match up with unencrypted info that helps you identify the individual, and then you can compare it against an encrypted password file. The old social engineering password, where I call you and say, I need your password. We've got an emergency in the technology server. We need your password so we can get out right away. Of course, you don't give it. Or the email from the Nigerian prince is going to leave you millions of dollars. So these types of social engineering passwords are used to gain access to organizational systems. You can use pretexting, where you say, I'm so-and-so and I need someone's password. To summarize this section, information security managers must thoroughly understand the internal workings of an organization and their partners, but you also have to be aware of how those entities, those outside entities, may threaten your information assets. Controls will help protect intellectual property rights, and it's essential for an information security manager to use those controls. Threats are present. You got to use controls to get around them. Possibly insurance is a method that you might want to use to guarantee continuity in the event of an attack beyond your control. Finally, even the most prepared organization is going to have problems, deviations in quality of service, and truly needs to prepare a plan that lets them ensure availability and security when unexpected events occur. Let's move now to the section 4 in chapter 1, where we're looking at more threats and attacks that an information security manager has to be prepared for. If you remember our learning outcomes, here we're looking again at the third learning outcome, where we are describing categories of threats, and we're going to look at a few examples that are interesting in this section as well. As information technology becomes more complex and difficult to manage, organizational vulnerability also increases, leading to more computer incidents. The number of entry points in a typical organization has ballooned over the years. For instance, think about how many technology products you have within your reach right now. 1 or 2 smartphones, a tablet, a laptop, a Surface Pro. As organizations encourage students and employees to bring their own devices, an IT security plan must be able to manage these devices when they are brought into or taken out of the organization. Cloud computing provides some protection in that the data is stored off-site. However, the organization then relies on the security of the external cloud computing firm to protect its own data, and that situation has its own inherent risk that must be considered. Human error or failure is a reality. Some of the reasons you might have for failure, well, first, this is one of the greatest threats to an organization, your own employees. They are the people that are closest to the information and may make a mistake. So they might use it in a way that they didn't know it was going to make a mistake. If it affects the healthcare outcome of someone, it could be a huge mistake. They may not follow policy. They may try to use shortcuts. They may be inexperienced, not have proper training. Information security manager makes sure they do. They may make incorrect assumptions that you didn't even think about. Some of the types of errors or failures: social engineering, which we already mentioned. Any type of fraud where you say, pay me and then I'll release your data, or if you don't pay me, I'll do whatever, I'll ransomware. You also might have phishing, spear phishing, or pretexting, where you use the normal willingness of people to help to their disadvantage by trying to get them to help you break into a system or learn a password. Human error can be mitigated with security education, training, and awareness. You might see it as SETA or CETA efforts. We certainly have heard about some information extortion events in the news recently. Theft of credit card numbers, Home Depot, Target, TJX, etc. Recent attacks have used ransomware to encrypt the user's data, and they say, hey, we'll unlock it if you pay the attacker. Or in the case of, have you heard of this person? Ashley Madison. It's a website that encourages married people to have affairs with other people and promise to keep their data protected. Also promise to scrub their data if they ever asked them to do so and paid them. They did neither of these. In fact, with the Ashley Madison case, they said, pay us or we're going to release all of the email addresses of your users. Ashley Madison said, we're not paying you. So they released them. You may have heard of the show, I think it's 19 Kids and Counting, that was on the Learning Channel. The oldest son, Josh, I think his name is, Josh Duggar, was caught. He had 5 or 6 email accounts that were obviously him. He was working with a very conservative think tank in Washington while he was doing this. He was fired. It's rumored that several people committed suicide because they were exposed. So I guess the moral of this story is, A, don't have an affair if you're married, and B, your data is never protected, and don't ever assume it is. But kudos to Ashley Madison for not paying the ransom. If you want to read more about this, you can go to this site or to others. It's really kind of an interesting topic to read about. It's hard to feel sorry for those people whose data was compromised. Sabotage or vandalism. This is where you go in and you destroy, you damage, you make the image of an organization look bad. If you have heart monitors that go out at a WellStar hospital, one of the WellStar hospitals, and it makes the news, you're going to get bad publicity, and people may elect to go to Northside instead, or wherever it might be. This could just be petty vandalism by employees just for fun, or organized sabotage against an individual or organization. It may make customers lose their confidence in you. It may lower sales. It may cause your stock price to drop, and your reputation can suffer. There are many examples of activism in the digital age. It's so easy to go online and be an activist. All you got to do is go. You don't have to give your real name. You can have an email or a Gmail account you use just for this. We've also seen cyber terrorism and cyber warfare increase. And there's been positive online activism where people are able to get together in ways that are unexpected. For example, the Arab Spring was able to use social networking to get people together to effect large-scale change in some cases. You may have heard about WikiLeaks. Julian Assange is in the Ecuadorian embassy in England, and if he leaves there, he will be arrested. The U.S. would like to arrest him, and I believe Switzerland or another European country also wants to arrest him. He says it's because he leads WikiLeaks. I believe he is supposed to be brought on charges of sexual assault, I think. Whether they're true or not, I don't know. But WikiLeaks first leaked the U.S. Embassy documents, made us look bad, could tell we had petty remarks about other leaders, just like people do. Don't do it. Don't type or send anything you don't want to see in the newspaper the next day, online newspaper. If you want, use an encrypted text messaging system called Signal. It encrypts from both sides. You got to have the key, and it's supposed to be unable to be detected. If it's on my phone, however, they can still look at it. You may have heard of this guy as well. This would be Vladimir Putin. It's alleged and agreed to by our intelligence agencies that they tried to meddle in the U.S. election. They did not, however, hack the election, which in my view means votes were changed. They didn't get to the voting systems, which aren't online and are very secure, in spite of some of the studies that question their integrity. They're more secure than paper ballots. And Putin also is accused of being involved in the email scandal with Podesta, who was the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton, and the DNC, which resulted in several people looking bad, being embarrassed, and resigning their jobs. Information security managers have to anticipate this. Let's look at what happens when your technology fails. If your hardware fails, it's like the Intel chip. There's a known or unknown flaw. In Intel's case, they knew about it. They just couldn't fix it at that time. It may cause your system to perform in ways you did not anticipate. It may give unreliable service or limit availability. Of course, if your technology is old, it may fail. It's more likely to fail than a newer machine. That's why usually organizations are on rolling cycles of replacing equipment. With software, it's sold before bugs are detected and resolved. For instance, Office always sells an early version, the very first version, and we pay to be beta testers. We buy the software. They know it's okay to have a certain number of bugs, so they do it. There may be a way that software and hardware work together that was unanticipated, and it may reveal, we have a new failure. It may be a bug or other failures that were unanticipated. And people may have put backdoors into the system so they can get in. A software manufacturer or hardware manufacturer, whoever it might be. You can keep up with the bugs that are out there if you look at this website that I mentioned above. To measure hardware failures, you look at the mean time between failure. This assumes that the item can be repaired. Right now, for instance, with the Intel equipment, Intel chip, there's no way to repair it. Hopefully they'll get a way to repair it. You also may measure mean time to failure. In this case, you say, hey, I gotta replace it. It's going to fail. I know it. And I need to do what I can. Mean time to repair does calculate how long it will take to be repaired. All of these things must be considered by the information security manager. Let's take a closer look at another technology failure that caused harm to people. THERIS-25 was a radiation therapy machine built during the 1980s. When there was an update, there were 6 incidents where patients received massive doses of radiation. One patient who had been receiving radiation therapy for quite some time got up off the machine and said they were giving him too much radiation. Canada's Atomic Energy Commission came out and reviewed the machine and could find no problems. Neither could the developers of the code. It turns out that users had found a way to shortcut one of the screens, and the shortcut was also a way to increase the radiation dose significantly. 3 of the patients died. A University of Washington investigation showed that lack of proper software testing was one of the key issues. You can take a look at this short YouTube video to get more information on the THERIS-25 incident. Lessons learned from this error include software can and will fail. Users will use the software in ways that you must anticipate. Testing may be difficult, costly, and time-consuming, but you must do it for safety-critical systems, particularly relevant in the healthcare industry. Reusing older software, which was done in this case, may be dangerous. In this case, it was. Safety and usability exhibit tensions on each other. To increase safety, you may compromise usability. The developers have to find the right balance of safety and usability based on the system being designed. In addition, for safety critical, you may have heard of this incident, the Sony incident. In this case, this was the first major attack on a U.S. company that used a highly destructive class of malicious software designed to make computer networks unable to operate. Happened on November 24, 2017. They called themselves the Guardians of Peace. And they hacked Sony. Sony had an unstable network that was unusable for days and sometimes weeks. Insider information was shared, made them look bad. There were 17 executives making over $1 million. Only one, Amy Pascal, is a woman. So that didn't help their image. Embarrassing employee emails were leaked that were petty, like we all can be at times. Large blocks of files, in this case about 200 gigabytes of data, was uploaded from the system to other unauthorized locations. Several movies which were due to hit theaters were released in full and downloaded 100,000 times. So even though they were able to eventually stop it, they lost a lot of money and had a very bad community image for some time. They even told people, don't check your personal email on your cell phone using our network. Another example of a safety critical system that may cause injury or death, you have to be flawless. The NASA programs, you got to be flawless. One error out of 1,000 is not good enough if people lose their lives. The key assumption is that just because we follow standard developmental methodology for our organization, for the industry, for whoever, that doesn't mean it's going to be safe. You have to do additional things, more thorough documentation. You must vigilantly check and recheck, anticipating what users might do. If you want to look at an example where technology was not working as promised, take a look at Chernobyl. And you can look at this video if you like, 25 years after Chernobyl. They were running a test at the same time that a device malfunctioned, which meant they could not bring the heat down, and we had the Chernobyl nuclear incident. Still seeing results of that to this day, even though they got everybody in Chernobyl, put them in buses, and they left left everything they had. You had the clothes on your back and probably one suitcase, never to return. They didn't know they weren't going to return at that time. The damage was actually not as bad in Ukraine as it was in areas north of Ukraine and even parts of Western Europe because of the prevailing winds at the time. Let's look at a couple of other examples that were called the Hall of Shame. One is a Russian warning system that in 1983 reported, guess what, the U.S. has just launched 5 nuclear ballistic bombs toward us, towards Russia. At the time, the person in charge was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. And he decided, you know what, this doesn't make good logical sense. The U.S. would launch much more than 5 missiles. So he didn't sound the alert, and we averted nuclear war. What happened in this situation? The system was supposed to filter out, quote, fake false missile detections caused by satellites picking up sunlight reflections, end quote. It did not, however. Thank goodness for Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, who is pictured here. In 1998, the Mars Climate Observer lander flew too low in the atmosphere and was destroyed. It's not like we could go and replace it. It was around Mars. In this case, what happened? A very minor error. A subcontractor at NASA used imperial units, like used in the U.S., rather than the NASA-specified metric units used by everyone in Europe. That small error caused a bad outcome. You've also got the Patriot missile failure at Dhahran on February 25, 1991. It was an Iraqi Scud missile. They were easy to launch. You could drive a truck and launch them, and you had no idea where they were going or how effective they would be. But we had a Patriot missile that was supposed to shoot down Scuds, and we said we would protect Israel and other countries as well as our own troops. Well, during testing, the Patriot had never been in operation for such a long time without pause as this system was for 100 hours. The system clock had drifted by 0.33 of a second. When rounding a floating point decimal, the two systems rounded differently. Due to the missile speed, the timing error meant a miss of 600 meters and significant numbers of troop casualties as a result. Again, if you have safety critical systems that affect health outcomes, you don't have the opportunity to be wrong. Another Hall of Shame, you may have even heard about this one, the Y2K problem. The computers only used 2 digits for the dates. They couldn't interpret 2000. In due deference to those who created the code, they never anticipated that their software would be used 25 years later. They thought it would be updated. Well, what happened here? You had a lot of COBOL programmers that were able to go and get government jobs where they had had no jobs previously. The code was either fixed or was absolutely no factor. They had said planes were going to crash. They didn't. The power stayed on. The internet stayed on. Our phones stayed on. So this was a disaster that didn't happen. But we did plan properly and try to get it fixed. Another one is a Northeast blackout in 2003. It was the U.S. Northeast and Midwest and Ontario. About 55 million people. That's significant. In this case, an alarm system didn't alert operators that they needed to redistribute power after there were overloaded lines that tried to find a path to get their energy. So a bug affecting the order of operations, very minor bug, caused the error and made 55 million people go without power for some time. Again, think about it from a healthcare standpoint. You've got to have those backup systems because you can't control this. To summarize, threats to an organization's information assets are only going to increase as you have more data points available, as you use cloud computing with external providers, as you have virtualization, which may increase vulnerability to external servers. There are going to be human errors. You need to account for them and control and try to make sure that you mitigate the risk there. With safety critical systems, particularly those that may affect human life, You gotta pay attention to make sure that you do protect life and don't have a catastrophic failure. You see extortion attempts and expensive failures when information security managers do not follow properly developed, appropriate policies for ensuring confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. Let's look at Part 5 of Chapter 1, Governance and Management of Information Security. We're back to those 4 learning outcomes that I promised we would cover, and here we're looking at the 4th one, where we look at governance and management of information assets of the organization. When you look at governance, it has multiple components to it. It makes sure that resources are used properly in the manner that they were supposed to be, and that only authenticated, identified users have access to only those things that they should have access. It is used to set the strategic direction of the organization in terms of the security of its information assets. It looks to try to help organizations meet objectives that have been established by delivering confidential system that has integrity and availability. And of course, it looks at managing risk. With governance, there's an emphasis on escalating InfoSec to the uppermost levels of the organization and providing it with an appropriate level of management. What you like to see is a C-level executive reporting directly to the president or CEO, and if not that, then an executive VP that reports to a C-level person with authority and the ability to get resources. If information security can't get resources, they cannot protect the data. There are 6 P's in information security management. They are, and we'll look at each of them: planning, policy, programs, protection, project management, and people. If we look at planning first, these are activities that support the design, creation, and implementation of the strategies identified by the information security manager. These plans must support not only the use of technology and the protection of information assets, but the protection of all assets in the organization. It is imperative that the Chief Information Security Officer or other designated C-level employee works closely with all senior managers in developing an information security strategy that is in line with a business strategy. If information isn't as valuable, you may put fewer protections on it, for instance. Organizations already do that with our login and password to buy goods online. They protect our credit card information and encrypt it. It still gets stolen sometimes. Our user ID and password, not often encrypted. Keep that in mind. I found that out the hard way. My Gmail was hacked. They went online and reset Facebook and then asked people for money. It was 8 a.m. to noon on a Saturday, or I would have gotten it earlier, and I had it back by 1 o'clock after I found out at noon. The types of plans that you have to do in terms of information security management: you have to have an incident response plan. What do I do when something happens? How do I keep business moving and data and information available? A business continuity plan. You have to anticipate a disaster like Sony had and have a way to recover from it. You have to plan policies that will allow you to secure your information assets. You have to have the appropriate staff in place throughout the organizations to ensure the security of your information assets. You have to make sure security is considered when new technology is rolled out. You have to plan for the risk that you may receive at an organization and have a way to mitigate the risk. And you want to have plans that allow for the education, training, and awareness of information security by all employees. If we look at policy, these are just organizational guidelines that say here's how you should behave in this situation. With information security, it's linked with your privileges, the access that you have, the level that you have for information assets. There are 3 general categories of policy: an enterprise information security policy, an issue-specific security policy, and a system-specific policy. And we'll look at these all later in the semester in more detail. Programs, these look at information security operations that are specifically managed as separate entities, not part of IT, not part of the general business, but part of information security with a broad organizational perspective. You got to have that CETA, that Security Education Training and Awareness program, in place. Other programs may include physical security. We put a lock on the door. Complete with fire, physical access, gates, guards, whatever level of security you need. For my Gmail password, they don't have to bring a police officer to make sure to stand guard, because if I lose access, it's not the end of the world. Your company loses access and information assets are compromised, you need to have perhaps that security guard standing there. Moving to protection. With this, you have a set of risk management activities that you plan in advance. It includes assessing risk and developing control and protection mechanisms to mitigate the risk, and having technologies and tools in place that also help you mitigate risk that may occur from employees inadvertently destroying data or external people as well. Each mechanism is one part of managing the information security plan. People are the most critical link in the information security program, and this includes security personnel and the security of your personnel, as well as aspects of security education, training, and awareness that we've mentioned before. But you have to make sure they don't make mistakes where possible, and they don't do anything they shouldn't do. Don't give them access, and it's not a problem. Finally, we have project management. You need to be a good project manager if you want to manage information security in your organization. Here you have to identify and control the resources that are used, and you have to measure progress and adjust. Information security is not a project, but it's a set of projects and processes. And each element of an information security program has to be managed as a project. If you're a project manager, you are going to be a much more successful information security manager, or any type of manager, I contend. Project management is essential. Some aspects of information security are not project-based. As we mentioned, they are managed processes that are ongoing. You protect your data always. Summarizing the last section of Chapter 1, proper governance structures must be in place to help the information security manager achieve strategic priorities, achieve company goals, mitigate and manage potential risk, provide methods of using resources in safe and responsible manners. The information security manager must have a proper governance structure in place to do all of these. Planning, policies, programs, protection, people, and project management skills are all necessary attributes of a successful information security plan and information security manager at an organization.